Thank you so much, May and Andrew and Catherine. I have shared with you before that this masterpiece on my head is the fruit of my handiwork, and that for some period of years I have been cutting my hair. In fact, my routine, though, is that once I'd lost so much hair and started cutting it really short, typically on Wednesdays, and then on either Saturday or Sunday morning, I'll cut it again. Because when you're looking at really thin margins, it doesn't take a whole lot of hair until it makes a bigger difference. Anyway, so that's been my routine for a number of years. But a few years ago, I decided to do something different once. And I was going that particular week. It was the first time I had gone as a chaperone with our children to CentraKid camp. And so I was thinking, well, normally I would midweek get a haircut, but I don't feel like taking clippers with me. So what I'll do is, this was my idea, if I just shave it with a razor, so just take it down to the skin, then by the time we get back, it'll be at about this length. And that way I won't have to take any clippers. And so I thought, well, that's pretty smart. And so I didn't say anything. And so that morning when I got a shower, I shaved my head completely. And I come in and I told Caroline, this is what I have done. And her response was, don't make a big deal about it to the other chaperones because you really can't tell. Anyway, because it was already so short and there's just not that much hair. Anyway, so she has said it won't make that much of a difference. What happened, though, is that I discovered as the day unfolded that it made a bigger difference than perhaps I would have ever thought. I say that because for years now, since I've lost my hair, if I'm outside, I'm going to have a hat on. And so that morning, we head off to camp, and by afternoon, by early evening, I go to take my hat off, or like go in or out or something, and I try to get it off, and it's like it is Velcroed to my head. And there is just enough stubble that just clings to that hat, and every time it was just trying to get this hat off my head. And you maybe need to write this note in your Bible, but you need a little bit of hair to kind of serve as a lining for your hat. And so what I discovered, though, is that what I thought was inconsequential, what I thought did not make a difference, what seemed to be insignificant, had far more significant consequence. What seemed to be so insignificant had far greater consequence. In truth, that statement is one that you and I are discovering how true it is over and over and over again throughout our lives. It's true not just with people in general and in life in general, but it's also true specifically as it relates to our walks with the Lord and to our personal relationship with Christ. That being said, while we understand so many times what we think to be insignificant or inconsequential actually has great consequence, so many times while we know that, we operate in defiance of that as it relates to our walk with the Lord. In fact, let me give you a very specific example. Many people, in fact, we all do this to varying degrees, as followers of Christ, when we have done something wrong, when we have sinned, what we are prone to do, what we are likely to do, is to hide it. Now, I hope you realize that's nothing new. In fact, as we get the beginning of the story all the way back in Genesis, what happens when Adam and Eve have first sinned? What was their first order of business? It was to hide. It was to hide. And ever since sin came into the world, people that know God are still doing the same thing. And you and I, unfortunately, many times are still doing the same thing today. But the problem is, hiding our sin yields absolutely no benefit, and what we think to be inconsequential can have grave and significant cost. It can harm us in significant ways. And that's what we're going to be thinking about beginning today in a new series that I'm calling It Wasn't Me. But today I want you to think with me about a very specific question related to that topic, and that's this. What makes someone a likely candidate to be someone who would hide their sin? What may lead someone to hide their sin? That's an important question because it may help you identify, it may help me identify if I'm actually doing that. We see the answer to that question today in Joshua chapter 7. If you would open your Bibles there with me. In fact, the text is not going to show up on the screen today because we're going to look at a number of different verses in and around chapter 7. And if you don't have a Bible, I hope you'll grab one from the pew rack. Open with me to Joshua chapter chapter 7. And again, we're thinking about the answer to this question: what may lead someone to hide their sin? Before we actually answer that question, I want you to think with me in terms of context as to what's going on. This comes to us from the book of Joshua. And Joshua, at this point, is now the leader of the people of Israel. Their previous leader has been Moses. And what's in the rearview mirror is that they've experienced slavery in Egypt for 400 years. They have been freed by the power of God. God's guided them to the promised land. We talked about this just recently. They sent the spies in. 10 came back and said, we can't take it. 2 said that we could. That was Joshua and Caleb. The people yielded to what the majority said, and so they decided, no, we can't do this. And because of that, God struck down everyone over the next 40 years that was age 20 and above. So there was that 40 years of wilderness wandering. That is now in the rearview mirror. And Moses is now dead. The children of Israel are getting ready to finally take the promised land, and Joshua is their leader. And as you go back to chapter 6, if you see in your Bibles there, the subject heading says, the Conquest of Jericho. Hopefully you recall that the Promised Land is not empty. There are people in the Promised Land. There are nations and city-states that are dotted throughout this territory that God is going to give them. So they're going to need to take possession of it. I don't know if you're aware of this. People don't typically just give up their homes and property. You've got to fight to take it. And the first place that they were going to need to take was the city-state of Jericho. Maybe you remember from Sunday school how that was to be taken. And God gave very clear, specific instructions as to how it was to work. And you remember, in fact, I'm just reading here, if you want to follow along in verse 1 of chapter 6, that Jericho was strongly fortified. Because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. They realized the threat that's on their doorstep. And God says, look, I've handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. So take all your soldiers, march around the city one time, and do this for 6 days. But then on the 7th day, what did God say? In verse 4, he says, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the trumpets. And when there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear it sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout, and the city wall will collapse, and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead. All right, so that's what God said to do. March around this city for 6 days, one time apiece. And on the 7th day, march around it 7 times. And on the 7th, blow your trumpets, shout, and what's going to happen is the walls are going to fall, and you can go in and take the city. Those were very clear, specific instructions. And as they have been given those instructions, there was also something they were told that was really important in verse 18. God told them and gave this clear instruction to Joshua, who gave it to the people. He said, but keep for yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's sanctuary. What God told them to do as they went into Jericho was to destroy everything. Every living person, with the exception of Rahab, was going to lose their life in the city of Jericho. And all the stuff that was there, none of that was to come back. None of that was to be returned as a spoil of war, except for gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And where was that to go? It was to go into the treasury. That was to go, that was set apart for God. So everything in Jericho is dedicated. It's either dedicated to destruction or it's dedicated to the Lord. None of this was to belong and become the personal property and possession of anyone. Everyone knew this. Everyone had this very clear expectation. All right, so having experienced these instructions, they do what God says, and you remember the story. They do exactly what God says. The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. They go in and take the city. And everyone does what was directed to them except for this one man named Achan. You see about him in verse 1 of chapter 7, where it says, the Israelites, however, were unfaithful regarding the things set apart for destruction. Achan, we're told, took some of what was set apart, and the Lord's anger burned against the Israelites. What did he take? If you skip down to verse 20 of chapter 7, he is confessing, and he describes that he took a beautiful cloak from Babylon. He took 5 pounds of silver and a bar of gold, weighing 1.25 pounds. So he's got 5 pounds of silver, 1.25 pounds of gold, and he's got this cloak that he saw and thought this was really nice. This is a great name brand. I'm going to hold on to this stuff for myself. In fact, what he did was to bury it. He hid it because he knew, everyone knew, none of this was supposed to take place. None of this was supposed to be his, but it was just too good to pass up. All right, so that is what has happened. Jericho has fallen, and the next city-state that needs to be conquered is a town or a city-state that has, it's so small, it's characterized only by 2 letters, A-I. Sometimes it's pronounced as A-I or A-E, depending on who you're looking at or listening to. I'm just going to call it A-I today, but this was a small, by comparison, enemy that needed to be defeated. And Joshua does something very prudent, and that was that he sent some spies in to scope out the territory. Hey, what are we up against? What do we need to be prepared for? What type of obstacles, what type of challenge are we going to be facing? And so having done that, the report comes back and they hear this. They're really a small people. They don't have much of an army. It's a small town, small group of people, 2,000 or 3,000 troops tops. That's all you need. Don't send everybody. That's just kind of a waste of resources. And so just a small army of men can take this. That's all you need. And so now bear in mind, they've just taken something significant with Jericho. So it's like they've just defeated this massive enemy, and now they've got this little JV team that they need to take on. This should be easy peasy. I mean, they ought to absolutely be able to take this. And so Joshua heeds their counsel and sends an army between 2,000 and 3,000 to go and take Ai. The problem is things don't go as planned. In fact, the people of Ai rebel, fight them back, chase them out of the city, absolutely embarrassingly defeat them, and 36 Israelites are killed. It seems that no one from Ai is killed. But 36 people, 36 Israelites have lost their lives. And so when this happens, in verse 6 of chapter 7, Joshua tore his clothes. He falls face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord until evening, as did the elders of Israel. They all put dust on their heads. He's just despondent. How in the world could this have happened? And in verse 7 he says, "O Lord God, why did you bring these people across the Jordan to hand us over to the Amorites for our destruction? If we'd only been content to remain on the other side of the Jordan." He's like, I regret the fact that we have advanced. We just should have stayed where we are if we were going to experience this humiliating defeat in front of this little, just tiny little ant of an army. It's an embarrassment to us. It's an embarrassment to us as the people of God. It's an embarrassment ultimately to you because we're a reflection of you as your people. And now this is, I just, for the life of me, I just do not get this. And in verse 10, Joshua hears the response of the Lord. And God says to him, "Stand up. Why have you fallen face down? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant that I appointed for them. They have taken some of what was set apart. They have stolen, deceived, and put those things with their own belongings. This is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies." So Joshua's been scratching his head saying, "God, why in the world did this happen? I don't get it. We beat Jericho, that's easy. But they're a massive enemy. And then we've got this little JV team. I mean, it's like we've just fought the Super Bowl champions, and now we've got to fight the Ragsdale High School football team. We beat the Super Bowl champion, but now we can't beat a high school team. This just doesn't make sense." And God says, the reason that you have experienced this loss is because of sin. It's because there were things that were dedicated to me that have become someone's personal property. You haven't done what I've said. Someone has sinned, and he indicates that they are hiding this. All right, maybe you're familiar with the rest of the story, but in case you're not, if you were to continue to read chapter 7, what happens is that the Lord reveals to Joshua that it's Achan. They go and search his tent, and buried is this cloak, and underneath it is this bar of gold and this silver. What happens is that he is executed. Not just he, but his entire family. They were stoned to death. And it wasn't simply enough to stone them to death. Then they burned their bodies and then heaped stones on their ashes. You say, well, wait a minute. That's awfully big. That's awfully consequential. But really, maybe that was then, this is now. But what I want you to understand is that this passage helps answer the question that we're thinking about. What may lead someone to hide their sin? Because even though the specifics of today are different, we're still talking about people. We're still talking today about people who know and walk with God, people who still hide their sin. And if it could happen to Achan, why in the world could it not happen to you? Why couldn't it not happen to someone in your home? We are prone to do this. What makes someone a likely candidate to do this? Based on what we see here, there's three answers, and the first is this. If you think you define sin, if you think you define sin, many have read this. Perhaps you have in Sunday school for years heard this story. You were very familiar with it. And maybe there's a part of you that says, I don't get it. I mean, I realize it's gold and it's silver and it's a cloak, but it's not that much. He didn't take all of it. He just took some of it. It was, a 5-pound bar of silver. It was 1.25 pounds of gold. Yeah, it was a nice cloak, but still. The cloak would have been wasted. Nobody was going to miss that much gold or that much silver. And we say that. I get the notion, I get the sentiment behind that, and it's not completely unreasonable, but it is nevertheless completely wrong. It is wrong because it defies this reality. Every sin, every one of them, is ultimately what? It is an action against God. My sin, every one of them, is a sin against not you, not my spouse, not my kids, not my neighbor, not my coworker. Every one of my sins is ultimately a sin against God. Every one of Achan's sins, every one of Joshua's sins, every one of your sins is ultimately a sin against God, because by definition, sin is transgression, or it's disobedience to who? It's disobedience to God. If, in fact, sin is an act against God, who gets to define it? Who gets to characterize what is and isn't sin? Well, the one against whom this action is committed. What I'm saying is, very simply, I may commit sin, but I don't get to define it. The one against whom my actions are committed, he and he alone is the one that gets to define what is and is not sin. And truly, in this 21st century, we are obviously witnessing great struggle with this notion, because we are operating in a society and a culture that believes that each successive generation gets to determine, and it keeps shifting what is in bounds and what's out of bounds. But understand this, my sin and your sin is not a sin against culture, it's not a sin against my neighbor. Ultimately, my sin, your sin, and everyone's sin is a sin against God, and by virtue of that reality, he and he alone gets to define it. When, however, you and I get to the point and place where we think, you know what, I think I'm going to call this one, I'm going to call that one, that one's more of a ball. That one's not in the strike zone. That one's going to be okay. When we get to the point where we start doing that, that makes us prone to be a likely candidate for hiding sin, because we think we can decide, well, it's not that big of a deal. Why did Achan do this? Why did he commit this act? And why did he hide it? I believe because he was thinking in his mind, it's not that big of a deal. It's not all the gold, it's just a little bit of the gold. It's not all the silver, it's just a little bit of silver. It's not all the clothes, it's just one cloak. Achan was operating as though he got to define sin. I remember, especially with some of our older boys, when it came to bedtime, sometimes I would read a story to them, but sometimes I would just be lazy and I would tell them a bedtime story. And sometimes I would get tired of telling some of the same bedtime stories over and over again. So what sometimes I would do is just start telling a story, and it might be one that they're familiar with, but it could change courses. So it may start off as the Three Little Pigs, but then it could become, I don't know, Little Red Riding Hood. And so as I'm going along and I'm doing this, repeatedly I had them say something to me like this: Daddy, that's not how the story goes. And my response every time was the same. This story is going this way because it's my story. I am making up the story, and so I get to say how it goes. Isn't that the case? If you are writing the story, don't you get to say how the story goes? If you are making up the story, don't you get to say how it goes? Sure you do. Why do you get to do that? Because when you are writing the story, you are in charge. And when you are in charge, you get to say how things go. Let me just remind you, it's true of me, it's true of you, it's true of every single one of us. None of us is ultimately in charge. I am not in charge, and you are not in charge. Let me remind you of what you might have learned to sing as a child. This is my Father's world. And even history itself is ultimately His story. Because of that, I am not able. It's out of my jurisdiction. It's beyond my pay grade to say what is in bounds and what's out of bounds. God and God alone gets to define sin because every sin is an act against Him. Achan's sin, he hides it because he thinks it's not that big of a deal. And he thinks that it's not that big of a deal because I guess he thought he was in charge. And he gets to say whether something is in bounds or out of bounds. And when you get to that point, I promise you, it's not just that you're going to sin, but you're going to try to hide it. But there's another characteristic of those that will try to do this, and that's if you think consequences are self-determined. If you think consequences are self-determined. Absolutely, you can read this story, you can hear this story, and think to yourself, man, that's a pretty stiff penalty. I mean, it's really big. I mean, it was 5 pounds of silver. It was 1.25 pounds of gold. It was a cloak. They shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have done this. But my goodness, I mean, he got stoned. But not just him. His whole family got stoned. His wife, his children. Well, we don't know who all that was part of the extended family that was a part of this, but it seems it's more than a few. It was a stack of people, and it seems like this became a national event. Israel came out and stoned them. This was terrible. It would have been brutal. It would have been a horrible, ghastly sight to watch people literally die by getting hit over and over and over and over with rocks. And as soon as they're dead, as if that's not enough, let's burn their bodies. Let's further desecrate, and it's as if we're trying to spit on them and to say just how loathsome what they have done, what he has done, actually is. But our thought, our sentiment that feels like it's so much is in part rooted not just in the notion that we think or are operating as though we get to define what is right and wrong. It's also rooted in the notion that we get to determine, or we think it's within our jurisdiction, what an appropriate level of consequence is. Reading this story, hearing this story, you may say, well, I don't like that. That doesn't pass the sniff test. That seems like too much. Well, let me just remind you, it is not simply the case that God and God alone gets to define sin. It's ultimately God and God alone that gets to determine fully the consequence of my sin. I can say it's just an insignificant thing. I can say it's not that big of a deal. I can say it doesn't affect anybody else. But what I say doesn't matter because I don't get to define it, nor do I get to determine what the consequence of it is. Could you imagine either presently or going back in your mind to your childhood years? Think about a scenario like this. Maybe it was that your parents, you've got a new bike, and they said, listen, I don't want you out riding your bike out in the road. You can ride it on the sidewalk, you can ride it on the driveway, but I'm telling you, I had better not find you out there riding your bike on the road. And while you might have heard that, it's entirely possible. And just imagine the scenario. You just want to see how fast you can go. You can't really do that on the sidewalk. You need to get out on the road. And so you've done that. You're out on the road and you are just scalding fast going down the road. And then all of a sudden Mama walks out or Daddy walks out. And you hear your name and your middle name. Which you know is really bad when you hear the middle name as a part of it. And so hearing that, you come back up to them. And maybe it is. Imagine this scenario. You say, you know what, Mama, I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't have been out on the road. You told me I shouldn't have been. And so I'll tell you what, because I did what I should not have done, you know what, I'm going to forego all of my broccoli tonight. I won't eat one piece of my broccoli. No, I have been a bad boy. I have been a bad girl. I've done something that I shouldn't, and so I will forego all of my broccoli. Do you think that would have gone over very well? No. I mean, you laugh at it because it's a laughable circumstance. And it goes back to the reality. You understand this. You may get to choose what your actions are. You make a choice about what your actions are, but you forego the right to determine what the consequences of those choices are. With respect to sin, not only do I not get to define it, I don't get to determine the consequences. And unfortunately, many times, virtually every time, the consequences are markedly greater than I would have ever in a million years thought them to be. You are a likely candidate to hide sin when you think you can define it, when you think that consequences are self-determined, and finally, if you think you are an island. If you think you are an island. It is pretty clear that what Achan did affected his family, didn't it? They all had a really bad headache that day. They all died that day. His wife didn't take anything, but Achan did. His children didn't take anything, but Achan did. Grandchildren didn't take anything, but Achan did. His brothers didn't take anything, but Achan did. But what happened? Every one of them died. Every one of them had their bodies burned. Every one of them had their remains piled under a mound of rocks. But it was not just they who died. It was also 36 Israelites who died. How many of them should have died? 0. Ai is just a little piddly place. 2,000 or 3,000 armed soldiers showing up would have probably been enough for them to just wave the white surrender flag and say, well, there's no use us even trying. But because of Achan's sin, they decided God moved in their hearts where they weren't going to do that. They chased the Israelites out of town. They killed 36 of them. And so the entirety of Achan's family has lost their lives. These 36 individuals, these soldiers have lost their lives. All of those families have been affected. It's a lot of people, an awful lot of people that were affected by the choices of what? One single individual. Let me just remind you that my sin doesn't just affect me. Your sin doesn't just affect you, and we are prone to make choices that are out of bounds, and we are likely to make choices that are at odds with what God has told us to do when we think and when we're falsely operating under the notion, well, it will only affect me. I'm telling you that it will not. And you have no control the extent to which it'll affect them, and you have no control how loud the volume of that effect is, how great the cost is, how great the difficulty and the pain that's caused because of what you may think to be so insignificant. A few years ago, I had taken our oldest 4, I think it was. GTCC had one of these. In fact, community colleges across the state, they were encouraged to do a science night to engage the community and try to get people on campus, I guess to stir up not only interest in sciences, but also in the community college and let people have a positive experience. It was completely free, and so somebody told us about it, and so we went over there. And it was very interesting, it really was. And GTCC's got a great observatory, so you've got this big telescope, and then they had all these other telescopes that were set up outside the observatory with students that are there helping explain what it is that you're seeing and you're looking at and answering all kinds of questions. That was pretty cool. They had one lab where where kids could dissect something, and so they could have, I think it was like a cow's eye or a sheep's brain, and there was a part of a lung that a kid could just hack away on. And so, I mean, it's not bleeding or anything, but I mean, kids are there, man, let me carve on this eyeball. And so, I mean, they were loving that. But one of the most interesting things was this classroom we went into, and the professor was talking about static electricity and about how it works, and they had a static electricity generator there, and it looks like a glass ball, and there's this belt that's going, and anyway, so it's creating static electricity. And what the professor did was to invite any kid that wanted to participate in this up to the front of the room. And so they come up and they form a circle around this static generator, and he asks them to hold hands. All right, so now they've held hands, and then the person that's closest to the static generator, he gives them a wand that they then touch the static generator with. And it was lovely to see. In fact, I've got some video of this. But the first, in fact, it might have been Andrew, I think maybe, that had the wand. And he touches it, and it's like Zeus. And every one of those kids gets zapped. It was wonderful. It's wonderful. But I mean, it doesn't hurt them. I mean, it's more, well, it's shocking is what it is. It didn't hurt them or anything. It was just a static charge, but it was enough to give you a little jolt, it catch your attention, though. And the reason that happened and what the professor was seeking to communicate is by virtue of the fact that you are all linked together. Just because you didn't touch the generator, you were still connected, though, to somebody that did, to somebody that was. Can I just let you in on this fact? That there is absolutely a sense in which we're all holding hands with a whole stack of people. We just are. And it may be that you're the person that touches the generator. And somebody in your family, they also feel the zap. Somebody at your work feels the zap. But I want you to think about it from a more spiritual perspective even, that maybe people in your church feel the zap. Pay attention to what you see in this passage. In verse 11, notice the plural language. Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant that I appointed for who? For them. They have taken some of what was set apart. They have stolen, deceived, and put those things with their own belongings. This is why the Israelites, why they cannot stand against their enemies. Do you see the repetitive, intentional use of the plural? What is God saying? Did everybody steal something? No. But Achan did. Who did it affect? It affected all of the people of God. Can I just let you in on this? That there is nothing that has changed from the days of Joshua. You say, well, that's the left-hand side of the Bible story. This is an Old Testament principle. But I'm telling you, read 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 5 where Paul says, listen, it is reported among you that there is sin that's not even found among the Gentiles. There's a guy having a sexual, incestuous relationship with his own mother. But you tolerate this. And Paul says this, he says, you need to expel the immoral brother. Why? Because, he says, a little leaven does what? It leavens the whole lump. What was God using Paul to say in the New Testament? That as part of the people of God, we're connected to each other. And that your choices affect me. And that my choices affect you. What did people experience in the days of Joshua? That as the people of God, Achan's choices affected them. If you think that you are an island, that you are living in a vacuum, I'm telling you, it's not simply that you're going to act out of bounds, but you're going to act out of bounds and you're going to hide it. Let me ask you then, who around you is paying the price? What is it that this church could be experiencing that it cannot because of what's inside of you that you've been hiding, that's buried underneath your tent? Nobody else knows, but God knows. You thought and you decided, oh, it's not that big of a deal, it won't matter, but it's really mattering. It's costing you, it's costing your family, it's costing your church family. Maybe it's time to quit hiding. Will you bow your heads with me?